In the epic chronicle of the Second World War, there was one battle that was not fought for a city, or an island, or a continent. It was a battle for a lifeline. A 6-year-long, brutal, anonymous struggle of attrition waged in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the North Atlantic. This was the battle to keep Great Britain, and by extension the entire Allied war effort in Europe, from starving. Every drop of fuel for its tanks and aircraft, every round of ammunition for its guns, every weapon for its soldiers, and almost every scrap of food for its people had to make the treacherous, 3,000-mile journey from the factories and fields of North America by sea. It was the war's single most critical supply chain, and lurking beneath the waves, waiting with cold, predatory patience to sever that lifeline, was the most effective commerce raider in the history of naval warfare, the German U-boat. By early 1943, the U-boat wolfpacks, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Admiral Karl Dönitz, were winning this battle. The happy time, for the U-boat crews had returned with a vengeance. Their strategy was built around a brutal, geographic advantage that seemed insurmountable. The reach of land-based air power was finite. Long-range bombers flying from England, Iceland, and Newfoundland could provide a protective umbrella over the convoys for the first few hundred miles of their journey. But in the center of the ocean, there existed a vast, 1,000-mile-wide chasm of open water that was beyond the range of any of these aircraft. It was a black hole in the Allied defenses. A place where a U-boat could surface with near-total impunity, recharge its batteries, radio the position of a convoy to its comrades, and coordinate the massed attacks of the wolf pack. The Allies called this zone the Black Gap. For the men of the U-boat service, it was their paradise. It was the untouchable heart of their hunting ground, the cornerstone of a strategy that, by every cold, logistical calculation, was strangling Britain and threatening to make the planned invasion of Europe an impossibility. From his command center, Admiral Dönitz was supremely confident, a confidence rooted in the unyielding laws of physics. He believed the Black Gap was an unsolvable problem for the Allies. The distances were simply too great. Conventional, fleet-sized aircraft carriers were far too valuable and too vulnerable to be risked in the brutal, submarine-infested waters of the North Atlantic. They were capital ships, designed to fight other navies, not to be tossed about in winter gales hunting for a single submarine. His entire naval doctrine, the very foundation of Germany's hope for victory at sea, was built upon this single, unshakable assumption: the mid-Atlantic was, and always would be, the U-boat's private domain. His intelligence was clear. His experience confirmed it. He believed it was impossible for the Allies to project meaningful and continuous air power into this central ocean void. But in the spring of 1943, deep within the supposed safety of the Black Gap, U-boat captains began to send frantic, bewildered reports back to headquarters. They were reporting something that, according to their own doctrine and their own commanders' assurances, was a physical impossibility. Out of the low, gray clouds, 500 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, a new kind of hunter was suddenly diving upon them. Often, the first sign of an attack was the high-pitched whine of an engine, followed by the deadly chatter of machine guns and the shocking explosions of depth charges straddling their hull. For the baffled U-boat crews, who believed themselves utterly alone and safe, it was as if these aircraft were appearing from nowhere. Their paradise was about to become their graveyard, and the source of their profound and sudden bewilderment was one of the unlikeliest, most unglamorous, and most decisive naval weapons of the entire war. The crisis in the Atlantic had become the single greatest source of anxiety for the Allied High Command. Winston Churchill, a man who had stared down the Blitz with iron resolve, would later admit in his memoirs, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." By March of 1943, that peril had reached its terrifying apex. In that single month, German U-boats sank over 100 Allied ships, a staggering loss of over 600,000 tons of irreplaceable cargo, fuel, and war material. It was the most successful month of the entire war for the U-boat force, and it brought the Allied logistical system to the brink of collapse. The math was simple and brutal. Ships were being sunk at a rate that far exceeded the combined shipbuilding capacity of Britain, Canada, and the United States. The lifeline was not just fraying, it was snapping. The search for a solution to the Black Gap had become an obsession for naval planners. The problem was one of circular logic. The convoys were being slaughtered because there was no air cover. The only way to provide air cover in the mid-Atlantic was with aircraft carriers. But conventional fleet carriers, like the USS Enterprise or the HMS Ark Royal, were seen as the crown jewels of the Navy. They were fast, powerful, and astronomically expensive capital ships, designed to fight fleet actions against the Japanese in the Pacific or the remnants of the German surface fleet. Risking a priceless 30,000-ton fleet carrier and its thousands of crew members to hunt for a single, cheap, 700-ton U-boat in the brutal weather of the North Atlantic was a trade that no admiral was willing to make. It was seen as a catastrophic misuse of a strategic asset. Several stopgap measures were attempted, none of them truly effective. The British developed a system of catapult aircraft merchantmen, or CAM ships. These were ordinary cargo ships fitted with a single, one-shot catapult that could launch a lone Hawker Hurricane. The pilot's mission was heroic, but suicidal. After engaging an enemy aircraft or spotting a U-boat, he had no way to land back on the ship. He was forced to either ditch his plane in the freezing Atlantic and hope to be rescued, or to parachute out near the convoy. Another idea was the merchant aircraft carrier, or MAC ship, a bulk grain carrier or oil tanker with a rudimentary flight deck built on top, capable of operating a handful of ferry swordfish biplanes. These were useful innovations, born of desperation, but they were too few in number and too limited in their capabilities to truly solve the problem. They were patches on a hemorrhaging wound. The strategic deadlock seemed absolute. The Allies needed a weapon that had the capability of a fleet carrier but the expendability of a merchant ship. They needed an airbase that could float, that could endure the hellish North Atlantic gales, and that could be built so quickly and so cheaply that its loss would be a tragedy, but not a strategic catastrophe. According to the rigid, traditional doctrines of naval warfare, such a ship was a contradiction in terms, a fantasy. But the demand for this impossible weapon came from the very highest levels. It came from President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who both understood, with chilling clarity, that if they could not close the Black Gap, the war itself could be lost. The call went out not for a better destroyer or a faster corvette, but for a revolution in naval thinking. A small, slow, ugly, and utterly indispensable aircraft carrier that could be mass-produced on an industrial scale. The revolution, when it came, did not emerge from the hallowed design bureaus of the traditional naval shipyards. It was born from the brute force pragmatic genius of American industrial production, championed by a man who embodied its spirit, the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by trade. He was a master of colossal construction projects, the man behind the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. He viewed the challenge not with the cautious, bespoke mindset of a naval architect, but with the ruthless mass-production logic of an assembly line manufacturer. His audacious proposal, fiercely supported by President Roosevelt, was simple: to take the hulls of standard, common merchant ships, cargo vessels and oil tankers, and convert them into small, functional aircraft carriers, and to do so on a scale that the world had never seen. This was the birth of the Escort Carrier, or CVE in the U.S. Navy's designation system. The press and the sailors who served on them would give them other, less formal names: Jeep carriers, baby flattops, or, more ominously, combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. The first true class of these vessels, the Bogue class, was built upon the hull of the standard C-3 cargo ship. The process was a marvel of improvisation. The entire superstructure of the merchant vessel was cut away, a simple, flat wooden flight deck was installed on top, a small, island superstructure for command and flight control was welded onto the side, and a single aircraft hangar was fitted below the flight deck. They were slow, with a top speed of around 18 knots, making them barely faster than the convoys they were meant to protect. They were unarmored, their hulls as thin as any freighter. And they were small, their flight decks barely 500 feet long, a terrifyingly short runway for the high-performance aircraft they were expected to operate. To the traditionalists in the Navy, these ships were an abomination. They were ugly, they were slow, and they violated every cherished principle of warship design. But they possessed one war-winning quality that overshadowed all their deficiencies: they could be built with breathtaking, almost unbelievable speed. While a massive fleet carrier like an Essex-class took years to construct, a Bogue-class escort carrier could be converted from a C-3 hull in a matter of months. Even more revolutionary was the subsequent Casablanca class, the first carriers to be designed and built from the keel up using Kaiser's mass production techniques. His shipyards, using prefabrication and around-the-clock welding, were eventually churning out these ships at a staggering rate. At its peak, Kaiser's yard in Vancouver, Washington, was launching a new aircraft carrier roughly every single week. This was a weapon born not of elegant design, but of overwhelming, relentless industrial logic. The Germans, with their meticulous, craftsmanship-based approach to U-boat construction, could produce a handful of submarines a month. The Americans were now producing an entire, sea-going airbase every 7 days. This was a fundamental shift in the mathematics of the tonnage war. The Allies were not just replacing their losses, they were deploying a weapon that would systematically dismantle the enemy's entire strategic advantage. The escort carrier was the physical embodiment of America's industrial might, a floating, unsinkable swarm of air power that was about to be unleashed directly into the U-boat's supposedly safe paradise. The ships themselves were a marvel of industrial expediency, but they were merely a platform. The true, lethal heart of the escort carrier was its air group, and the men who flew its planes were a special breed of aviator, engaged in what was arguably the most dangerous and demanding flying of the entire war. Life on a jeep carrier in the North Atlantic was a unique form of hell. These small, flat-bottomed ships were notoriously unstable in the heavy seas. They would pitch, roll, and corkscrew with a violent, unpredictable motion that made even the most seasoned sailors sick. For the pilots, this was a life-or-death variable in every single takeoff and landing. Their runway was not a stable, 3-acre field of concrete. It was a tiny, slippery, bucking strip of wood that was often rising and falling by as much as 50 feet in a matter of seconds. The primary weapon of these air groups was a composite squadron, typically consisting of Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The Wildcat, though already being replaced by the faster Hellcat on the big fleet carriers, was a perfect fit for the escort carrier. It was a rugged, dependable, and relatively easy-to-fly aircraft, its sturdy landing gear able to withstand the brutal, controlled crashes that passed for landings on a CVE. Its mission was twofold: to provide a combat air patrol to shoot down the long-range German Focke-Wulf Condor reconnaissance planes that would shadow the convoys and report their position to the U-boats, and to strafe surfaced submarines with its 6.50 caliber machine guns, forcing them to submerge where they were blind and slow. The true U-boat killer, however, was the Avenger. This large, powerful torpedo bomber was adapted for a new kind of warfare. Instead of torpedoes, it was armed with a deadly combination of depth charges and, later, the new Fido acoustic homing torpedo, a weapon the Germans did not know the Allies possessed. Flying long, grueling 8-hour patrols over the gray, featureless expanse of the ocean, the Avenger crews would hunt for the telltale wake of a surfaced U-boat or the electronic signature picked up by their primitive, but effective, air-to-surface radar. The moment a U-boat was spotted, the hunter-killer dance began. The Wildcat would dive in, guns blazing, suppressing the submarine's anti-aircraft fire and forcing it to begin its crash dive. This gave the Avenger the precious seconds it needed to line up its attack, dropping its depth charges in a precise pattern around the submerging submarine. This was a brutal, relentless, and incredibly personal form of combat. Unlike the high-altitude, impersonal warfare of the strategic bombing campaign, this was a face-to-face duel fought at sea level. The pilots could often see the faces of the German sailors on the U-boat's conning tower as they made their attack runs. They flew in appalling weather conditions, often in near-zero visibility, navigating by dead reckoning, with a constant, gnawing fear that if their engine failed or they missed their tiny, moving home in the vastness of the ocean, their chances of survival in the freezing water were almost zero. These were the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic, the men whose courage and skill turned the industrial miracle of the escort carrier into a ruthlessly effective killing machine. The first true test of the escort carrier doctrine came in the spring of 1943, a period that would forever be seared into the memory of the German U-Boot WWII as Black May. It was a month that saw the entire, carefully constructed edifice of Admiral Dönitz's strategy come crashing down in a storm of sudden, bewildering, and catastrophic losses. The instrument of this destruction was a new and revolutionary tactical formation, the hunter-killer group. This was no longer just a defensive screen for a convoy. This was an offensive weapon, a small, independent task force composed of a single escort carrier and a screen of several destroyers and corvettes, whose sole mission was to proactively seek out and destroy U-boats in the heart of the Black Gap. The pioneer of this new form of warfare was a single, unglamorous ship, the USS Bogue. The Bogue was the lead ship of her class, a converted C-3 cargo hull that had been rushed into service. Along with her escorts, she was assigned not to a convoy, but to the heavily trafficked sea lanes south of Greenland, the very epicenter of the wolfpacks' hunting ground. The Bogue and her sister ships did not wait for the U-boats to find the convoys. They used a sophisticated and evolving form of intelligence to find the U-boats. High-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, aboard the escorting destroyers could triangulate the position of a U-boat every time it surfaced to make a radio report. This information was then relayed to the carrier, which could launch its aircraft to pounce on the unsuspecting submarine. For the German U-boat crews, the world turned upside down almost overnight. 4 years, they had operated with the confident assumption that the surface was a relative safe haven in the mid-Atlantic. They would surface, report their positions, and leisurely coordinate their attacks. Suddenly, the sky was filled with an enemy they never expected. A submarine commander, surfacing his U-boat in what he believed to be the absolute safety of the Black Gap, would be shocked by the sudden appearance of an American Wildcat fighter diving out of the low clouds, its machine guns ripping through his conning tower. Moments later, an Avenger bomber would be on him, dropping a perfect pattern of depth charges. The attacks were relentless, precise, and they came from a direction that, according to German naval intelligence, was impossible. Over the course of Black May of 1943, the German U-boat force suffered a level of attrition that was not just unsustainable, but apocalyptic. 41 U-boats were sunk in that single month, a catastrophic loss of nearly a quarter of their entire operational fleet. More devastatingly, the losses included many of Dönitz's most experienced and successful veteran commanders, the irreplaceable aces of the deep. The hunter-killer groups, with the escort carrier at their heart, had transformed the U-boat's paradise into a slaughterhouse. The psychological impact on the surviving German crews was profound. The confidence that had bordered on arrogance was shattered, replaced by a pervasive, gnawing fear. The sky was no longer empty. The enemy was no longer hundreds of miles away. The enemy was now directly overhead, and he was hunting them. Inside the Befehlshaber U-boot, the U-boat command headquarters, a state of profound and agonizing bewilderment took hold. Admiral Dönitz, a man whose entire strategic vision was built on a foundation of meticulous calculation and superior intelligence, was now confronted with a series of events that defied all logic. His teletype machines chattered with the final, frantic reports from his best commanders, reports that spoke of surprise air attacks in Seagrid squares where no Allied airbase existed. His plotting tables, which had for months shown a steady victorious rhythm of Allied sinkings, were now becoming a horrifying mosaic of lost U-boats. The sinkings of Allied merchant ships plummeted, while the losses of his own submarines skyrocketed to a rate that was completely, utterly unsustainable. Dönitz and his staff were trapped in an intellectual crisis, an intelligence black hole. Their entire operational model was predicated on the immutable fact of the Black Gap's existence. The sudden appearance of enemy aircraft in this sacred zone was a phantom that their doctrine could not explain. The initial German reaction was one of disbelief and denial. They theorized that the Allies must have secretly developed a new, super long-range bomber with an impossible combat radius. This was investigated and found to be false. They speculated that the British and Americans must be using secret island airbases, perhaps in Greenland or the Azores, that German intelligence had somehow missed. This, too, proved to be a fantasy. The German search for an explanation became increasingly desperate. One theory that gained significant traction within the high command was that the Allies had developed a new, revolutionary form of ship-based radar or listening device, a superweapon that could detect a submerged U-boat from dozens of miles away. This fear of a technological wonder weapon became an obsession. It led them to hastily coat their U-boats with a special rubber coating, codenamed Alberich, in a futile attempt to make them invisible to sonar. It led to the installation of new, complex radar warning receivers, which themselves were often faulty and only added to the crew's paranoia. They were chasing a technological ghost, a phantom solution to a problem they fundamentally misunderstood. The truth was so much simpler, and so much more damning to their own intelligence apparatus. The Allies had not invented a new kind of bomber, they had simply invented a new kind of airbase. The German Naval Intelligence Service, the B-Dienst, which had been so brilliantly effective in the early years of the war, had completely and utterly failed to detect the existence of the American Escort Carrier program. They had no idea that the United States was mass-producing these small, floating airfields on an industrial scale. Dönitz was trying to solve a tactical problem, assuming the board was the same as it had always been. He was intellectually incapable of grasping that the Allies had not just added a new piece to the game. They had fundamentally, and secretly, changed the entire board. His entire strategy, an elegant and deadly edifice of logic, was crumbling because its foundational assumption had been rendered obsolete overnight. The psychological impact of this new, inexplicable threat rippled through the entire German submarine service, from the opulent command bunkers in Berlin to the cramped, foul-smelling confines of the U-boats on patrol. The veteran commanders and crews, who had once viewed themselves as the elite, the apex predators of the war at sea, were now the hunted. The cocky, swaggering confidence that had defined the happy time evaporated, replaced by a pervasive and deeply corrosive sense of dread. Every moment on the surface, once a period of relative relaxation, was now fraught with tension. A simple act like recharging the batteries or transmitting a weather report became a life-or-death gamble. Any U-boat captain knew that at any second, a wildcat or an Avenger could drop out of the perpetual gray overcast, spitting death. This new reality forced a catastrophic change in U-boat tactics. Admiral Dönitz, still clinging to the flawed belief that the primary threat was a new form of shipborne radar, ordered his submarines to spend as little time on the surface as possible. This was a death sentence for the wolf pack. The entire wolf pack concept was predicated on the U-boat's surface speed and their ability to communicate. A U-boat was not a true submarine in the modern sense. It was a submersible torpedo boat, faster on the surface than it was underwater. It was on the surface that a wolf pack could race ahead of a convoy, coordinate with its fellow submarines by radio, and position itself for a massed, multi-directional night attack. By forcing his boats to stay submerged, Dönitz was effectively blinding them and shackling them. Underwater, a U-boat was slow, its listening gear was its only sense, and its ability to communicate was non-existent. In a desperate attempt to fight back, Dönitz ordered a radical and ultimately suicidal change in policy. He commanded his U-boats, when caught on the surface by an aircraft, to not crash dive, but to stay on the surface and fight it out with their anti-aircraft guns. This was a disastrous miscalculation, born from a complete underestimation of the destructive power of a modern naval aircraft. A U-boat's conning tower might be fitted with a handful of 20mm or 37mm cannons, but these were no match for the 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber heavy machine guns of a Wildcat, which could suppress the German gun crews, followed by the depth charges of an Avenger, which could shatter the submarine's pressure hull. This fight it out order turned many U-boat conning towers into slaughterhouses and led to a spike in losses. The final, devastating blow to U-boat morale was the introduction of new Allied weaponry that seemed to border on magic. Escort carrier aircraft began to be equipped with the FIDO acoustic homing torpedo. Dropped into the water near a submerged submarine, this weapon would autonomously hunt the U-boat, homing in on the sound of its propellers. For a German crew, submerged and blind after a crash dive, the experience was terrifying. They would hear the depth charges explode, survive the initial attack, and then, in the silence, they would hear a new, high-pitched whine approaching them, a sound they could not evade and could not fight. It was the sound of a thinking weapon, a fire-and-forget killer that seemed to confirm their worst fears. Their technological superiority was gone. Their tactical advantage was gone. And now, even the cold, dark safety of the deep was no longer a refuge. As the German U-boat offensive in the North Atlantic crumbled in the face of the escort carrier groups, These versatile and ubiquitous ships were already being adapted for a new and equally vital role, supporting the great amphibious invasions that would characterize the Allied drive to victory. From the rocky shores of Sicily to the beaches of Normandy and the volcanic sands of the Pacific Islands, the Jeep carrier was repurposed from a submarine hunter into a floating, mobile artillery platform, the indispensable provider of close air support for the troops hitting the beaches. If the hunter-killer group was the CVE's first great strategic contribution, then its role in amphibious warfare was its second, equally decisive, act. The problem of an amphibious invasion was immense. In the critical opening hours of a landing, as the first waves of infantry struggled to establish a foothold on a hostile shore, they were at their most vulnerable. They were often beyond the range of their own land-based tactical aircraft, and the naval gunfire support from battleships and cruisers, while powerful, was often inaccurate against well-dug-in enemy machine gun nests and artillery positions. What the soldiers needed was air power that was immediate, precise, and directly responsive to their needs. An aerial cab rank of fighter bombers that could loiter just offshore, waiting for the call to strike a specific target that was holding up the advance. The escort carrier, slow and vulnerable in a fleet action, was the perfect tool for this job. During Operation Torch in North Africa, Operation Avalanche at Salerno, and most famously, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy, fleets of escort carriers formed a steel ring around the invasion beaches. Their flight decks were a hive of constant activity, launching and recovering their Wildcats and Avengers, which were now armed not with depth charges, but with 500-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets. Their mission was no longer to hunt submarines, but to act as the eyes and the airborne artillery for the ground forces. Pilots would be in direct radio contact with forward air controllers on the beaches, who could call in an airstrike on a specific German pillbox or gun emplacement with a speed and precision that naval guns could never match. For the German soldiers defending the Atlantic Wall, the effect was devastating and demoralizing. Any strongpoint that opened fire was almost immediately set upon by a swarm of aircraft that seemed to appear from just over the horizon. Any attempt to move a panzer division up to counterattack the beachhead during daylight was met by roving packs of fighter bombers that turned the roads of Normandy into a shooting gallery. The German commanders had expected to have hours, if not days, to smash the beachhead before the Allies could establish their own airfields on French soil. They were utterly baffled and strategically paralyzed by the fact that the Allies had brought their airfields with them. The humble, unglamorous escort carrier had once again rendered a core component of German defensive doctrine completely obsolete, providing a protective steel umbrella under which the Allied armies could pour ashore and begin the liberation of Europe. While the escort carriers of the Atlantic were winning their grim, attritional war against the U-boats, a second, even larger, and more dramatic story was unfolding in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Here, the CVE was not a niche, specialized weapon, but the absolute backbone of the American naval advance. In the great carrier versus carrier fleet actions like Midway and the Philippine Sea, it was the big, fast fleet carriers of the Essex and Yorktown classes that seized the headlines. But in the long, grinding, island-hopping campaigns that defined the war against Japan, it was the ubiquitous, workhorse jeep carrier that did the bulk of the dirty work, performing a host of vital, unglamorous, and absolutely essential tasks that made the entire American strategy possible. The sheer number of escort carriers produced by the United States is a testament to their central importance. Of the approximately 150 aircraft carriers built by the United States during the war, an astonishing 122 of them were escort carriers. These were the ships that provided the air cover for the endless convoys of troopships and supply vessels that stretched across the Pacific. They were the platforms that ferried thousands of replacement aircraft and pilots from the West Coast to the forward areas, acting as the vital logistical bridge of the air war. And most critically, they were the core component of the air support groups for virtually every single amphibious assault, from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines. In the Pacific, the CVE's mission was expanded and refined. Their composite squadrons of Wildcats and Avengers were tasked with a dizzying array of missions. Before an invasion, they would fly hundreds of sorties to soften up the island's defenses, bombing enemy airfields, strafing troop concentrations, and suppressing coastal artillery. During the landings, they performed the same close air support role they had perfected in the Atlantic, acting as the on-call air force for the Marines and Army infantry struggling ashore. After the beachhead was secured, their aircraft would fly anti-submarine patrols to protect the vast armada of transports and supply ships anchored offshore. They were the maids of all work, the floating, multi-purpose airbases that provided the indispensable utility work that allowed the glamorous fleet carriers to focus on their primary mission, seeking out and destroying the Japanese fleet. This division of labor was a source of profound bewilderment to the Japanese naval command. Their doctrine was built around the decisive, all-or-nothing fleet engagement. They did not have an equivalent to the escort carrier, and they failed to grasp its strategic importance. They saw the CVEs as small, insignificant targets, and consistently underestimated their combat power and their sheer, dogged persistence. But it was this persistence, this ability to remain on station for weeks at a time, providing a constant, grinding, and inescapable aerial presence, that choked the life out of the Japanese island garrisons and paved the way for the American advance across the Pacific. The Jeep carrier was the humble, utilitarian foundation upon which the entire American war in the Pacific was built. Despite their unglamorous reputation and their slow speed, the escort carriers and the men who served on them were destined to play a central role in what is arguably the greatest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. It was here, in the waters off the Philippines, that a small group of Jeep carriers and their destroyer escorts, left exposed and seemingly helpless, would find themselves facing the full, terrifying power of the main Japanese battle fleet, including the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. Their actions in the face of impossible odds would become one of the most heroic and legendary chapters in the history of the United States Navy. The American escort carriers at Leyte Gulf were organized into 3 task units, with the code names Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Their primary mission was, as always, to provide close air support for the American ground forces that had just landed on the island of Leyte. The main American battle fleet, the fast carriers and battleships of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, had been lured away to the north in pursuit of a decoy force of Japanese carriers. This left the slow, unarmored Jeep carriers of Taffy 3, a group of 6 CVEs and their screen of 7 small destroyers and destroyer escorts, as the only thing standing between the vulnerable American landing beaches and the massive steel fist of the Japanese center force. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the lookouts on Taffy 3 made a report that was, at first, dismissed as a catastrophic error. On the horizon, emerging from a rain squall, were the unmistakable pagoda-style masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy's main battle line. It was Admiral Kurita's center force, a fleet that included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a host of destroyers. At its heart was the super battleship Yamato, a 72,000-ton monster armed with colossal 18.1-inch guns. The American sailors in their tiny, tin-clad ships were facing a force that outgunned them, outranged them, and possessed a colossal advantage in speed and armor. By any rational calculation, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated in a matter of minutes. What followed was not a battle. It was a desperate, 4-hour struggle for survival against impossible odds, a fight that Admiral Chester Nimitz would later call one of the most heroic and well-fought actions in the annals of naval warfare. The American commander, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, ordered his tiny carriers to turn and run, launching their aircraft as they fled, while his destroyers, in an act of almost suicidal courage, charged directly at the Japanese battleships, firing their torpedoes and blazing away with their small 5-inch guns. The pilots of the CVEs, with no time to properly arm their planes for an anti-ship roll, took off with whatever they had. Small anti-personnel bombs, depth charges, and in some cases, nothing at all, and threw themselves at the Japanese fleet, making dummy attack runs to draw fire and distract the enemy gunners. The fight became a chaotic, swirling melee, fought at point-blank range, a battle of astounding courage against overwhelming force. In the swirling chaos of the battle off Samar, the desperate, improvised tactics of Taffy 3 created a level of confusion and psychological shock within the Japanese command that was completely disproportionate to the actual military threat they posed. Admiral Kurita, on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, was utterly baffled. He was a battleship admiral, a practitioner of a rigid, highly structured form of naval warfare. He had expected to find the vulnerable American transport ships and to engage them in a methodical, long-range gunnery duel. Instead, he had blundered into a hornet's nest. He was being attacked from all directions at once, by enemies who seemed to possess a suicidal disregard for their own survival. The American destroyers, ships less than a tenth the size of his own flagship, were charging directly into the teeth of his main battery, their guns blazing in a hopeless but heroic display of defiance. More bewilderingly, he was under constant, relentless air attack. His lookouts were reporting strikes not from the powerful dive bombers and torpedo planes of a fleet carrier, but from a swarm of smaller aircraft, appearing and disappearing into rain squalls. The ferocity and sheer, dogged persistence of these air attacks convinced Kurita that he was not facing a handful of insignificant escort carriers. He became convinced, in the fog of battle, that he had engaged Admiral Halsey's main Third Fleet, the very force he had been trying to avoid. The courage of the American pilots and destroyer crews had created a phantom, a ghost fleet in the mind of the Japanese commander. The pilots of Taffy III pressed their attacks with a fury born of desperation. They strafed the bridges of the Japanese battleships, they dropped depth charges on heavy cruisers, and they flew their dummy runs with such conviction that Japanese gunners wasted tons of precious ammunition firing at empty planes. The cumulative effect of these pinprick attacks, combined with the torpedo runs of the destroyers, began to take a toll. A Japanese heavy cruiser was sunk, others were damaged. The constant harassment disrupted the Japanese formations, broke their command and control, and sowed a deep and paralyzing sense of confusion. After 4 hours of this relentless, chaotic battle, Admiral Kurita made one of the most controversial and inexplicable decisions of the entire war. He had victory in his grasp. The American escort carriers were crippled, 2 of them were sinking, and the path to the vulnerable landing beaches at Leyte was wide open. Yet, believing he was facing a superior force and having lost cohesion in his own fleet, he gave the order to break off the attack and retreat. The sailors and pilots of Taffy III, exhausted, battered, and facing certain annihilation, watched in stunned disbelief as the colossal Japanese fleet turned and steamed away. They had faced a god of war, and through sheer, unadulterated courage, they had made it blink. The combustible, vulnerable, and expendable jeep carriers had saved the entire Leyte invasion. When the guns fell silent and the Second World War came to a close, the escort carrier, the humble workhorse of the Allied navies, quickly faded from the public consciousness. History, with its preference for the grand and the glorious, chose to remember the epic clashes of the fast fleet carriers at Midway and the thunderous broadsides of the battleships. The slow, ugly, and expendable CVE, the ship that had been born from a crisis and built on an assembly line, was relegated to a historical footnote, its monumental contribution largely forgotten. Most of the escort carriers were decommissioned and scrapped within a few years of the war's end, their job done, their moment of glory past. But to dismiss the escort carrier is to fundamentally misunderstand how the war at sea was truly won. Its legacy is not written in the annals of great fleet actions, but in the cold, hard mathematics of logistics and attrition. It was the weapon that broke the tyranny of distance. In the Atlantic, it was the tool that closed the black gap, transforming the U-boat's untouchable paradise into a graveyard. It was the linchpin of the hunter-killer groups that systematically dismantled the German wolfpack strategy, a victory that was not just important, but was an absolute precondition for the survival of Great Britain and the eventual invasion of Europe. Without the victory won by the CVEs in the mid-Atlantic, D-Day would have been a physical impossibility. In the Pacific, its contribution was even more profound. It was the logistical backbone of the entire island-hopping campaign, the floating airbase that made the American strategy of amphibious assault viable. And at the battle off Samar, the men of a handful of these forgotten ships, through an act of almost unbelievable courage, turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever sortied, saving an entire army. The escort carrier proved that in a global, industrial war, victory is often achieved not by the most powerful and elegant weapon, but by the most numerous, the most adaptable, and the most persistent one. The CVE was the perfect embodiment of the Allied war-winning philosophy, a fusion of overwhelming industrial production, pragmatic technological innovation, and the sheer, dogged courage of the ordinary sailors and pilots who were asked to do an impossible job with it. It was a weapon that was consistently underestimated by its enemies, a blind spot in the rigid, honor-bound doctrines of both the German and Japanese navies. And in that underestimation lay the secret of its stunning success. The Jeep carrier never won the glory, but it won the war. And in the final, sober accounting of history, that is the only victory that truly matters.